She called 911. She begged for help. He was outside, armed. And yet, police walked away. Hours later, Michaela Carter was dead. The rain that night fell in slow, heavy drops, each one tapping against the apartment window like a warning no one would hear. Inside, Michaela's voice trembled over the phone as she spoke to the emergency dispatcher. She told them James Leggett, her estranged husband, was there. She told them he had a gun. She told them she feared for her life. She had done everything the system told her to do. She had a protective order in place. She had documented the abuse. She had left him. She had called for help. But help would not come. When police arrived, they saw him. They knew of the order of protection. They heard the fear in her voice. And still they made a choice that would change everything. They left. The clock ticked toward midnight. The world outside was quiet except for the wet hum of streetlights and the distant hiss of passing cars. Inside, Michaela tried to hold on to the thought that maybe, just maybe, she was safe now. But James Leggett was not gone. He was waiting, watching. Hours later, as her 25th birthday approached, James would force his way inside. Multiple gunshots shattered the silence. By the time neighbors emerged, Michaela lay lifeless. Her death was not just a crime, it was the end result of years of warning signs ignored, cries for help dismissed, and a justice system that claimed to protect but failed when it mattered most. Michaela Carter was more than a name in a police report. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with dreams that stretched far beyond the walls of that apartment. She wanted to live. She wanted to be free from the man who had terrorized her for years. But she never got the chance. And James Leggett, he was not an unknown danger. He was a known threat. He had shown his violence before. He had been given the boundaries of a court order and chose to break them. He had been seen, heard, and still allowed to walk away. This is not just the story of what happened in the final hours of Michaela Carter's life. It is the story of what led there, the choices, the oversights, the warnings that should have stopped it all. It is about a family left shattered, a community asking questions, and a police department facing scrutiny it could not ignore. This isn't just the story of one woman, it's the story of a system that failed her, and in telling it, we face a question we cannot look away from. How many more will be left unprotected before something changes? If you are drawn to investigative storytelling that seeks truth and demands accountability, subscribe and join us as we walk through every moment, every decision, and every mistake that led to the loss of Michaela Carter. The answers begin now. Michaela Carter was born and raised in Tennessee, surrounded by a close-knit family that knew her as someone with a light that could fill a room. Friends described her as vibrant, caring, and fiercely protective of the people she loved. She grew up in a home where birthdays were celebrated with homemade cakes, where laughter often spilled out onto the porch, and where the bonds between mother and daughter were unshakable. Michaela had ambitions beyond her small corner of the world, dreams of advancing her career, building a home of her own and traveling. She wanted a life that was steady, safe, and full of joy, but she would cross paths with a man who would change that trajectory forever. James Leggett's early life left traces of instability that would later become patterns of control and violence. While outwardly he could be charming, quick to smile and attentive in the beginning, beneath that surface was a growing tendency toward dominance, possessiveness, and anger. Those who knew him before Michaela spoke quietly about his temper, about moments when he reacted far more aggressively than the situation demanded. And there were incidents, small at first, that hinted at the violence he was capable of. When Michaela met James, she was in a chapter of her life where she was open to new connections. Their relationship began like many do. Kind gestures, warm conversations, a sense of being chosen. To those around them, James appeared committed. But over time, subtle changes began to take root. He wanted to know where she was at all times. He questioned who she spent time with. Isolation crept in quietly. Friends saw her less, family visits became shorter. phone calls went unanswered. The emotional control shifted into verbal aggression, then physical intimidation, and finally, violence. Like many victims of domestic abuse, Michaela found herself caught in the cycle: apologies followed by promises, short stretches of calm, and then another eruption of anger. The pattern repeated until leaving seemed both necessary and dangerous. Nashville, Tennessee, where this story unfolded, is a city known for its vibrant music scene and Southern hospitality. But behind the glow of neon lights and the sound of guitars in every bar, the city also carries a history of domestic violence cases that often don't make the headlines. Statistics at the time revealed a troubling reality. Protective orders were common, yet enforcement was inconsistent. Local advocacy groups spoke often about victims falling through the cracks of a system strained by limited resources and procedural gaps. In the neighborhoods where Michaela lived and worked, community attitudes toward domestic violence were shifting but still tangled in stigma. Victims were too often asked why they didn't just leave. Rarely was the focus placed on why abusers continued to harm without facing real consequences. Police departments were under increasing scrutiny for their handling of such cases, with some officers dedicated to domestic violence response and others treating calls as routine disturbances. For Michaela, the decision to finally separate from James was not made lightly. She had endured years of escalating abuse, each incident leaving deeper emotional and physical scars. Filing for a protective order was a step toward reclaiming her safety, a formal acknowledgement that James was dangerous and needed to be kept away. That piece of paper was supposed to mean something, that if he came near her again, there would be consequences. But as the days ahead would prove, a court order is only as strong as the system willing to enforce it. Michaela's family rallied around her in the months following the separation. They tried to help her rebuild, to remind her of the person she had been before James's shadow loomed over her every day. Yet James was not willing to let go. The protective order was not a deterrent. It was a challenge. He watched her, waited for moments when she was alone, and reminded her in subtle and overt ways that he could still reach her. Friends recall Michaela speaking about her fear openly. She would check her surroundings before walking to her car. She avoided certain places. She had begun to understand that leaving an abuser does not always end the danger. It can intensify it. Statistics supported her fear. The most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence is often after leaving the relationship. And then came the night that would lead to the 911 call. The tension had been building for weeks. James had been spotted near her neighborhood before. He had sent messages, some pleading, some threatening. On that night, when she saw or was alerted to his presence near her home, she acted quickly. She called 911, her voice shaking as she explained that her estranged husband was outside with a gun. She told them about the protective order. She told them she feared for her safety. In the dispatcher's office, her words were recorded, the tone of her voice preserved for the record. Officers were sent to the scene. They spoke with her. They saw him. They knew who he was. And yet, in a decision that would later haunt the department, they left without arresting him. For Michaela, the hours after the police left were filled with uncertainty. Had they scared him off? Would he come back? She had done everything she could, called for help, presented the protective order, made her fears clear. But in Nashville that night, the streets were wet with rain, and somewhere in the shadows, James Leggett was still waiting. By morning, the life Michaela had fought to reclaim was gone, ended by the man she had once trusted, the man she had tried to escape. Her death would not only devastate her family, it would expose the failures of a system that was supposed to protect her, igniting a legal battle and public outrage that would echo far beyond Tennessee. This was not just the story of an argument gone too far. It was the story of a woman who saw the danger coming, who begged for help, and who was still left alone to face the threat she feared most. The protective order against James Leggett had been filed weeks earlier. It spelled out the danger he posed to Michaela Carter in plain language. He was prohibited from contacting her, from coming near her home, her workplace, or any place she was known to frequent. It listed prior incidents, instances of physical violence, threats, and intimidation. In the eyes of the court, this was enough to justify legal protection. In the eyes of Michaela's family, it was a lifeline. But a protective order, no matter how strongly worded, cannot physically stop someone intent on doing harm. It relies on enforcement. And on that night, enforcement would fail her. The night of the crime began like so many nights in her recent life, quiet but laced with unease. Michaela was aware that James had been lingering near her neighborhood. She had told friends she was on edge, that she was keeping her phone close, that she was prepared to call for help if needed. That call came at 11:56 p.m. Her voice on the 911 recording was tight, trembling but clear. She told the dispatcher, "My husband, my ex. He's here. He's outside. He has a gun. I have a protective order. Please, I need someone here now." She gave her address, repeated that she feared for her life, and urged them to hurry. Every word carried the weight of someone who knew the danger wasn't hypothetical, it was immediate. Patrol units were dispatched. Officers arrived. They saw James's vehicle, confirmed who he was, and were aware of the protective order in place. Yet, after speaking briefly with Michaela, they left without making an arrest. The reasons for this decision remain a point of deep contention. Officers later claimed there was no clear cause to detain him, that they lacked sufficient evidence in that moment. But for Michaela, the message was clear. The system she had turned to for safety would not act. In the hours that followed, the night pressed on. The rain that had been falling earlier had slowed to a drizzle. Streetlights cast pale circles of light onto the wet pavement outside her home. Inside, Michaela was alone with her thoughts. Her birthday was just hours away. She would be 25. She had plans to celebrate with her mother, to enjoy a simple day surrounded by love. But somewhere nearby, James was still watching, still waiting. At 4:00 a.m., the quiet broke. James approached her home again, this time armed and determined. Witnesses later reported hearing a rapid series of gunshots, sharp cracks echoing in the early morning darkness. He shot her multiple times, the bullets tearing through the fragile barrier between survival and tragedy. Neighbors called 911 again, reporting the sound of gunfire, the chaos outside. When first responders arrived, Michaela was found gravely wounded. Despite their efforts, she could not be saved. She died in those early hours, on the cusp of a milestone she would never see. Her life was ended in the place where she should have felt most secure, her own home. Eyewitness accounts described the scene with haunting clarity. One neighbor said they saw a man fleeing toward a vehicle immediately after the shots. Another recalled hearing a woman's cry cut short. Police radios crackled with urgency as the manhunt for James began. She was just hours away from turning 25, her mother would later say, her voice breaking. She had so many plans. She wanted to move forward, to be free of him, and they left her here, with him still out there. In the days that followed, the image of Michaela's last hours stayed with those who knew her. Her phone, left on a nearby table, still had messages from friends wishing her an early happy birthday. Her kitchen counter had ingredients she'd bought for a small breakfast celebration. These fragments of her everyday life stood in painful contrast to the violence that had taken it away. Family members spoke publicly, not only to mourn her but to question how this could have happened. "She did everything she was supposed to do," one relative said. "She got the order, she called the police. She told them exactly what was happening, and still she's gone." The emotional weight of those words was impossible to ignore. Here was a young woman who had faced years of abuse, who had taken every legal and procedural step to protect herself, and yet the system designed to safeguard her had stepped back at the most critical moment. Friends remembered her as someone full of life, quick to laugh, always willing to help. She had talked about wanting to travel, to see places she'd only read about. She wanted to go back to school, to build a career where she could help others. Her dreams, now frozen in time, became the focus of grief and outrage. That night was not simply the result of one man's violence, it was the product of a chain of failures. Failures that began long before the final shots were fired. Failures that allowed James to continue his pattern of abuse unchecked. Failures that left Michaela's warnings unanswered. In the hours after her death, James was taken into custody. But for those who loved her, that arrest was not justice. It was only confirmation of what they had feared all along, that the danger she faced was real, and that no one had acted in time to stop it. By sunrise, news of the shooting had begun to spread. Local headlines carried her name, framing her as another victim in a long line of domestic violence cases that had ended in tragedy. For her family, the public recognition was hollow. What they wanted was not awareness after the fact. They wanted her alive. Her story, in those first reports, was stripped down to the basics. A young woman shot by her estranged husband, despite having a protective order in place. But behind those words was a far more human truth. A life interrupted just hours before it could reach a milestone. A daughter taken from her mother. A future stolen by someone who had once promised to love her. And as the community began to process the details, the question hung in the air, like a wound that would not close. How could this have been allowed to happen? When the call came in about shots fired at Michaela Carter's home, police response was immediate. But this time it was too late. The street was soon flooded with flashing blue lights, the hum of engines, and the low murmur of officers coordinating over radios. Paramedics pushed through the narrow walkway to reach her, but their faces told the truth before any words were spoken. Michaela was gone. The crime scene was quickly cordoned off. Yellow tape stretched between fence posts, keeping back neighbors who had gathered in stunned silence. Evidence markers dotted the damp ground, each one placed beside a shell casing, glinting faintly under the streetlights. Detectives moved deliberately, photographing the scene, measuring distances, mapping the path James had likely taken. James Leggett was located and taken into custody within hours. He offered no resistance. For investigators, the arrest was straightforward. But the question pressing on everyone's mind was not who had done this, but why nothing had been done to stop it before it happened. That question only grew louder as the details came into focus. The timeline of events in the hours before Michaela's death began to reveal glaring inconsistencies. She had called 911. She had told the dispatcher that James was outside her home with a gun. Officers had responded and spoken with her. They had confirmed the existence of a protective order, an active legal document that made James's presence and possession of a firearm an arrestable offense. And yet, they left. Why? In the days following the shooting, reporters pressed Metro Nashville Police Department officials for answers. At first, the explanations were vague. Claims about insufficient probable cause, the difficulty of confirming whether a gun had been present, procedural limitations. But internal records later revealed that the officers on scene had not even attempted to locate the firearm James was reported to be carrying. This revelation drew sharp criticism from advocacy groups, legal experts, and, most of all, Michaela's family. Her mother, speaking to local news outlets, described the night as a complete abandonment of responsibility. She questioned why the protective order had not triggered an immediate arrest, and why officers had not remained on scene to ensure her daughter's safety. It was not long before her grief turned into determined action. Michaela's mother began speaking publicly about the failures in her daughter's case. She attended city council meetings, met with domestic violence prevention advocates, and pushed for formal investigations into police handling of protective orders. Her advocacy extended beyond personal loss. She was building a case that Michaela's death was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a broader pattern. She soon filed a lawsuit against the Metro Nashville Police Department, alleging negligence in their response and a systemic failure to protect victims of domestic violence. As the legal process began, so did the public scrutiny. Statistics on domestic violence enforcement in Nashville began to surface, painting a troubling picture. Reports showed that in many cases, violations of protective orders did not result in immediate arrests. In some instances, police cited lack of resources, in others, misinterpretation of the law. Advocates argued that these explanations masked a deeper issue, a culture within certain departments of treating domestic disputes as lower priority calls unless violence had already occurred. Michaela's case was now evidence in a larger conversation about how the justice system responds to threats before they turn into crimes. National experts were brought in to comment on the patterns. Across the country, stories emerged of victims who had protective orders, who had reported threats, who had begged for intervention, only to be attacked or killed when enforcement failed. The parallels were striking and devastating. A 2019 study frequently cited in coverage showed that nearly half of all women killed by an intimate partner had sought help from the police in the year before their deaths. In too many of those cases, protective orders were in place. Michaela's name was now among them. The institutional failures extended beyond the night of her death. Investigators learned that James had prior documented incidents of violence. Some had resulted in arrests, others in warnings. In each instance, the cycle had continued. This history was not hidden. It was in police records, court filings, and the protective order itself. For her mother, these facts were more than painful. They were infuriating. They knew who he was. They knew what he had done before. They knew he was capable of this. And still, they walked away. As the lawsuit progressed, the Metro Nashville Police Department faced mounting pressure. Internal reviews were initiated, though critics questioned whether these reviews could be truly impartial. Advocacy groups pushed for independent oversight, arguing that self-examination was not enough. Public trust in the department's handling of domestic violence cases began to waver. At city meetings, residents demanded answers, pointing to Michaela's case as the clearest example of what could happen when warnings were ignored. The case also caught the attention of state legislators, some of whom began discussing possible reforms: tighter requirements for arrest in protective order violations, better training for responding officers, and increased resources for domestic violence units. But for those closest to Michaela, these conversations were both necessary and unbearably late. Each proposal, each policy draft, came with the unshakable truth that they were born from a loss that could not be undone. In interviews, her mother's voice carried both sorrow and resolve. She spoke of Michaela's courage in leaving James, in seeking legal protection, in calling for help the night she was killed. She made it clear that her fight now was not only for justice for her daughter, but for every woman who might find herself in the same desperate position. The investigation into Michaela's death closed quickly. James was charged, and the physical evidence left little room for dispute about his actions that night. But the investigation into the system that allowed it to happen was far from over. It was becoming clear that this was not just about one man's violence. It was about the layers of institutional inaction that had left Michaela vulnerable. And as those layers were peeled back, the failures stood in stark relief. The missed opportunities to act, the reluctance to enforce laws already in place, and the quiet normalization of risk in situations that should have been treated as urgent threats to life. For the Carter family, these truths were unbearable, but they refused to let them fade into silence. Their fight was now part of Michaela's legacy, a push to ensure that the next call for help would be met not with hesitation, but with the urgency and protection every victim deserves. The lawsuit filed by Michaela Carter's mother against the Metro Nashville Police Department was not just a civil case. It was a public indictment of a system that had failed in the most devastating way. Filed in the months after her daughter's murder, the complaint laid out the timeline in unflinching detail. The protective order, the 911 call, the arrival of officers at the scene, and their decision to leave without arresting James Leggett, despite clear grounds to do so. The legal argument was simple and damning. Officers had a duty to enforce the protective order, to investigate the presence of a firearm, and to take immediate steps to remove the threat. By walking away, the suit claimed, they had created the very conditions that allowed James to return and kill Michaela. Michaela's mother, in interviews and court filings, made it clear that this was not just about financial compensation. Her fight was for public accountability. She wanted answers about why the law had been ignored, why her daughter's warnings had been dismissed, and why the department's own protocols had not been followed. The lawsuit became a rallying point for advocates and survivors of domestic violence in Nashville. Organizations that had long pushed for stronger enforcement of protective orders saw Michaela's case as a tragic but powerful example of why reforms were urgent. Press conferences were held outside the courthouse. Editorials in local papers demanded change. The settlement. After months of legal maneuvering, the city agreed to a settlement. The amount, reportedly in the hundreds of thousands, was publicly disclosed. But the more significant impact was in what it represented, an admission, at least implicitly, that the police response had been inadequate. For Michaela's mother, the settlement was bittersweet. It provided some measure of recognition, but no amount of money could undo the choices made on the night her daughter was killed. "It's not justice," she told reporters. "Justice would have been my daughter turning 25, alive and safe." Public reaction to the settlement was mixed. Many saw it as a step toward accountability, while others criticized it as the city's way of avoiding a trial that might have exposed even deeper failings. For domestic violence advocates, the outcome underscored the need for more than just financial resolutions. What mattered was whether real change would follow. Public media pressure. From the first reports of Michaela's murder, the media played a central role in keeping the case in the public eye. Local TV stations ran investigative segments examining the police timeline. National outlets picked up the story, framing it within the broader epidemic of intimate partner violence in the United States. This sustained coverage put Metro Nashville police under intense scrutiny. Department officials issued public statements expressing condolences to Michaela's family and promising internal reviews. They stopped short of admitting wrongdoing, but they acknowledged that the case had raised important questions about how protective order violations were handled. Reforms promises. Under mounting pressure, the department announced several policy changes. Officers would now receive mandatory retraining on domestic violence response, including clear protocols for handling protective order violations. Dispatchers would be given expanded authority to escalate calls involving armed suspects in domestic cases. A dedicated domestic violence unit was promised, staffed with officers specifically trained to assess threats, gather evidence, and coordinate with victim advocates. There was also talk of integrating real-time protective order databases with patrol officers' in-car systems, reducing the chance of oversight in the field. Advocates welcomed these changes, but many remained skeptical. They pointed to other cities, such as Seattle and San Diego, that had implemented more comprehensive systems years earlier, with specialized teams that automatically responded to protective order violations and carried out immediate arrests when threats were reported. Nashville's reforms, they warned, would mean little without consistent enforcement and oversight. Critique of the justice system. One of the most difficult questions for Michaela's family and supporters was whether any of the officers involved in the response to her 911 call faced personal consequences. The answer, as far as the public record showed, was no. No terminations, no suspensions without pay. The internal review cited errors in judgment, but concluded that they did not rise to the level of formal disciplinary action under department policy. This decision fueled further outrage. Critics argued that without real consequences, there was little incentive for officers to treat similar calls differently in the future. For Michaela's mother, it was another example of how the justice system seemed to protect itself more than the people it was meant to serve. The broader implications of the case extended far beyond Nashville. Advocacy groups used Michaela's story in campaigns for national legislation that would strengthen federal oversight of protective order enforcement. Legal scholars discussed it in seminars on civil rights and law enforcement liability. Michaela's death had become both a personal tragedy and a case study in systemic failure. The lawsuit, the settlement, the reforms, and the continued fight for accountability were all part of her legacy. For her mother, that legacy was a heavy burden, one she had never wanted, but one she carried because she refused to let her daughter's story fade into another statistic. "If the system couldn't save Michaela," she said at a candlelight vigil, "then we will fight to change the system for the next woman who calls for help." And with that promise, the legal chapter of Michaela Carter's story closed, but the push for accountability, reform, and justice carried on. The days following Michaela Carter's murder were a blur of shock, grief and disbelief for her family. Her mother moved through each moment as if underwater, replaying the events over and over. Her daughter's fear, the unanswered plea for help, the officers walking away. Then came the silence, the kind of silence that follows an irreversible act. Impact on the family and community. Within hours of her death, friends and neighbors began leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten notes outside the apartment complex where Michaela had been killed. The sight was both beautiful and unbearable, a community's love set against the backdrop of violence. Her family decided to mark her 25th birthday, which had been just hours away when she was killed, with a vigil. Hundreds gathered, holding candles in the cold evening air. Balloons were released into the night sky, their ascent watched through tears. Speakers took turns sharing memories of Michaela, her warmth, her determination, the way she lit up when she was with her younger cousins. A friend read aloud a letter Michaela had once written to herself about wanting to build a life where I feel safe, loved and free. The face of a broken system. As media coverage spread, Michaela's face became a symbol, an image in news articles, advocacy flyers, and online petitions. For many, she represented every woman who had gone through the legal process to protect herself and still ended up unprotected. Advocates pointed out how her case exposed multiple points of failure: a system that granted a protective order but didn't enforce it, a 911 response that didn't prioritize her safety despite clear evidence of danger, and an investigative culture that often treats domestic disputes as less urgent until it's too late. The public discussion turned to the role of victim blaming in such cases, how victims are often asked, "Why didn't she leave?" instead of "Why wasn't he stopped?" Michaela's story made it clear that leaving doesn't always end the danger. In fact, it can escalate it. Domestic violence in America. Michaela's murder was tragically familiar to advocates who work in the field. In the United States, nearly half of all women killed by men are murdered by current or former intimate partners. Studies show that the presence of a firearm increases the risk of homicide by more than 500% in domestic violence cases. Her case mirrored countless others across the country, women who called for help, who had protective orders in place, who were promised protection, and instead found themselves abandoned by the very systems designed to shield them. Reform movements sparked. In the weeks after her death, local activist groups began organizing under her name. Michaela's Law was proposed by a coalition of domestic violence advocates. The proposal aimed to require mandatory arrest for any violation of a protective order involving a weapon and to establish a state database accessible to all responding officers. Policy lobbyists began pressing lawmakers for stronger enforcement measures and more comprehensive officer training. Community workshops were launched to teach people how to identify warning signs of escalating abuse and how to safely intervene or report concerns. Social media campaigns used Michaela's image alongside statistics about domestic violence, urging followers to call legislators, donate to shelters, and share information about resources. The pain that remains. For Michaela's mother, these efforts were both comforting and painful. She was grateful her daughter's name was making a difference, but each headline and rally was a reminder of the reason it was happening. She continued to speak publicly, giving interviews and attending forums on domestic violence policy. At one event, she told the crowd, "Every time I share her story, it feels like I'm reopening the wound, but I'll keep doing it because silence is what kills women like Michaela." The community, too, carried the trauma. For weeks, the apartment complex remained quiet, neighbors glancing over their shoulders. Some moved away. Others began checking in on each other more often. Final messages from those who loved her. As the first anniversary of her death approached, Michaela's family gathered for another vigil. This time, they displayed a board filled with photographs, her laughing at a family picnic, holding her niece wearing her graduation gown. Friends and relatives took turns speaking. One cousin recalled how Michaela used to call late at night just to say she loved her. A childhood friend remembered the time Michaela helped her through a difficult breakup, saying, You deserve someone who makes you feel safe. Her mother closed the vigil with a simple but powerful message. Michaela was not a statistic. She was my daughter. She had plans, she had dreams. And if her story changes one policy, saves one woman, keeps one family from feeling this pain, then her voice will still be heard. The candles flickered in the night as the crowd stood in silence. It was a silence different from the one after her death. This one carried not just grief but resolve. Michaela's life had been interrupted, but her story had become a call for change, a reminder that justice is not only about what happens in court, but about the systems we build to protect those most at risk. Michaela Carter's name will forever be tied to tragedy, but it should also be tied to who she truly was. Before the headlines, before the court filings, before the vigils, she was a daughter, a friend, a dreamer. She loved fiercely. She laughed easily. She looked out for those around her in quiet, steady ways. Her friends describe her as someone who could walk into a room and make even the most guarded person feel at ease. Her mother remembers her as strong-willed, someone who would fight for the people she loved, even when the odds were stacked against her. Those moments, her volunteering at community events, the way she planned small surprises for loved ones, the phone calls just to check in, are the pieces of her story that too often get buried under the weight of the crime that took her. And they are exactly the moments that must be remembered if her legacy is to be more than just the sum of her final hours. Reflecting on the larger questions. When we step back from the details of that night in Nashville, the questions loom large. How many more times must we hear this story? How many more women must walk the path Michaela did, filing for protective orders, calling for help, trusting that the system will act, only to be met with indifference until it is too late? Was this murder preventable? Absolutely. The signs were there. The warnings were given. The danger was known. And yet from the moment she made that final 911 call, the protections she had fought for became meaningless. The order on paper did not stop the man with the gun outside her door. The uniformed officers at the scene left without making an arrest. The system failed her at every junction where it could have saved her. And perhaps the most haunting question, where did it fail most? Was it in the policy that didn't require immediate arrest? In the training that didn't prioritize her call as urgent? In the lack of accountability that allowed past failures to repeat? Or was it in the deeper cultural mindset that still treats domestic violence as a private matter rather than the imminent threat it so often is? An invitation to the audience. If you're watching this, I want to hear from you. If you have lived through domestic abuse, if you have had to call for help and felt unheard, your voice matters here. Your story matters here. Share it in the comments if you feel safe to do so. You never know who might hear it and find the courage to seek help themselves. If you are someone who works in law enforcement, advocacy, or the legal system, what can be done differently? What will be done differently? This is not a story that should be consumed passively. It's one that demands participation, because the cost of inaction is measured in lives like Michaela's. Ending with purpose. Michaela Carter's story should not only be remembered, it should be acted upon. If her death is allowed to fade into just another headline, then the system remains unchanged and the cycle continues. But if her name becomes a rallying cry, a reference point in every discussion about domestic violence reform, then she will continue to protect others in a way the system did not protect her. Her life mattered. Her voice mattered. And even though that voice was silenced, the echoes remain through her mother's advocacy, through the community's calls for reform, through every person who hears her story and refuses to let it happen again. Let Michaela's story not just be remembered, but be a call to action. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And above all, remember her, not just for how her life ended, but for how she lived, for the dreams she carried, for the love she gave, and for the change that still can and must be made in her name.